So I'm gonna find my screen somewhere. Always have too many windows open. Okay. Start from the beginning. Okay, so as Jenny said, today we're going to be doing some training on GRIPP2, but this is about the 9th time that I've done this training now, and every time it sort of slightly evolves and changes a bit, and I've found that people also want a bit of a chance to talk about public involvement and co-production in general as well, so the training sort of got a little bit longer because GRIPP2 is sort of like the final step in well, one of the final steps in the journey around public involvement. So trying to explain what to put in it, you almost need to start at the beginning and say, you know, why are we doing this and what we're doing. So today we're just going to cover a little bit about the ARC processes and what we do and how we do co-production in the ARC. We're going to talk a little bit about evaluating the impact of co-production on research. We're going to hopefully have time for some discussion. And then if I don't get to GRIPP2, start prodding me and telling me we need to actually learn what GRIPP2 is and how we use it and what we're going to do with it. And then we'll talk a little bit about limitations of the tool and how we might measure progress as well. So in terms of the ARC itself, these are some of the aims that were written into the ARC bid, that we would embed public involvement and health inequalities in all our work, and that's from idea generation to implementing findings. And this is a map of our geographic area that we cover. So this is the northwest coast, so down from Cheshire, Merseyside, up around Lancashire, and also quite a substantial part of South Cumbria. So we have this sort of commitment to not only involving people in our research, but actually co-producing that research, which to me means sort of having people as members of the research team to sort of think about what kind of research we might want to do and making sure that it's relevant to the populations that we are geographically covering in our regional areas, and thinking about those kind of inequalities and deprivation and the differences in health between different areas that we cover. Okay, so this is when we're going to use our website. So what does co-production mean to you? So why are we doing this again? Why do we even want to involve the public in our research and co-produce it? What does co-production mean to you? So if you can go to that website that I put in the chat and you put that code in, and then you can add, I think, as many words as you want, or even phrases. It doesn't have to be single words about co-production and what it might mean to you. So I'm going to go to that website now so we can see it in real time.
I can't actually see your link. I did type it in though. Is it a different code, Selena?
Is it a different? Let me just check. Well, as in it doesn't come up when you do it?
Something did come up and then it wouldn't let me in still.
Let me have a look. Is anyone else able to do it?
So I click submit and it says there is a code written in the box, but I think it's just numbers. So did you read out the code that you've got there, or should the code come up automatically?
I'm going to...
Yeah, the code that's there automatically is just a generic one. You have to input
just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, I haven't got... I can see... I can see the chat, but there's nothing in it. So yeah.
It's 1173.
Yeah.
277.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's working.
Fabulous.
Fab. Thank you.
Just trying to find the website. It's here somewhere. There we go. That's what I want, I think. So hopefully, can you see that now, what the screen? So hopefully once somebody's put some words in, it should start to look like. Yay. Perspectives representing this equality and voices. Is everyone else managing to use it okay? Oh yeah, there we got a few more. Meaningful, relevance, equality. Just give it a couple more minutes. So who has everyone had a go? I think 2 of you have had a go. Who has not had a go yet? Susanna, were you able to access it? Yeah? Oh, there we go. That means everyone's had a go now.
Yeah, I just
put some in. Oh, fantastic. Thank you. I like the way that every time I do this, we end up with like different words and a different word cloud. It's interesting to see people's perspectives on it and what comes up each time. Right, I'm gonna stop sharing that for now. You can always leave it open, and if you think of anything else, just stick it in while we're carrying on. Okay, go back to this one. Okay. Brill. So, from the words that we were sort of putting down, why do people want to involve the public in research? Not necessarily ourselves. Obviously, there's different reasons why individuals might want to involve the public, but why do you think just, institutions in general or academics in general want to involve the public in research? Just shout out. It's fine if you've got anything.
I think in my experience working with clinicians, they tend to really want to involve the patients because they have they're aware that their perspectives are very different. As a treating clinician, your perspective is very different from the person who is receiving that treatment and experiencing that condition. So I think that's it's really important to have their perspectives, because I think that clinicians are aware that they're very biased in their views towards, conditions.
Yeah.
Especially when it's something that they're a specialist in.
Yeah. That's a good point. So anyone else?
From my perspective, to increase uptake. So if they're involved in creating the intervention, for instance, they're more likely to do the exercises, for instance, be more physically active. If they're involved, you may say, oh, HIIT is the best type of exercise, and then you tell everyone to do it, but no one, if you spoke to the people, like, oh, I don't enjoy that type of exercise, I'd rather be playing games, I'd rather be doing this, that, or the other, the more likely to uptake and actually take part in the intervention and gain the benefits of what you actually want to see.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so you think we might make assumptions that aren't necessarily right about groups of people? I suppose, and people can be very different in different places as well, and different kinds of people.
Yeah, I think even just the initial appeal of a study. For example, one that we've been involved with is with the young people in Alder Hey, but using their public involvement group to design the logo for the study. And they've changed the name of the study. And obviously they'll be involved with how all of the written documentation around it. So it's just the initial appeal, what it looks like, and obviously how it reads, just making it easy to understand and appealing straight from the get-go.
Yeah.
Important.
So it could also be around trying to make sure that people, so you can get a good number of people getting involved in the research as well. They're not put off by things that we're not aware of, maybe, if it's
and that they understand what what it's about, and it's not in our language, then it's in their language.
Yeah, that's very true. I went to like a local bar on the weekend, which is like all the posh ales and things, and I ended up talking to like an academic from, I think it was like material science or something, and he just was like so academic. I was trying to understand what it was that he was doing, but like even as an academic myself, I really like, I think he'd had a drink as well, but I couldn't really fathom what he was trying to say about what he did around material science at all. So it reminded me that it's quite easy for us to forget that people don't necessarily understand what we're talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Susanna, is there anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I think it's really useful if they can suggest us about our topic, because there are many research which is not really based on the public needs. So I think it's really useful if we are doing research about something really important.
To make sure that it's important to the people themselves rather than just what we think is important. Yeah, good. I put right at the top funding. So, I think sometimes people have this assumption that people don't really want to involve members of the public and that they feel like they have to because it's like a requirement rather than something that they really want to do. But we'll have some time for discussion about how your own experience of being around involvement. So we'll find out in a bit whether it's because you have to or because you want to. Okay, so some of the literature argues that if we do research in this sort of collaborative way, and like I said, the ARC tries to involve people in co-production, so not just asking people about things like Jenny was saying about like the logo and the public information, but actually designing the research and doing the research together. As well, and that the idea is that it would create this sort of better quality research, and that the research questions, like Susanna suggested, would be like the most important ones to members of the public, and like Sean said, make it more likely that the research will be acted on and have an impact once it's been done. And there is also this argument that it's a moral obligation and that it's ethically correct to involve members of the public in research, especially when you look at something like the ARC, which is publicly funded by the NIHR. If it's publicly funded, then we should ethically involve members of the public in the research, and that it's more inclusive. And also, I always personally think that we have a sort of an obligation to help members of the public understand science and research better. If we look at something like what's happened with COVID at the moment and people's fears around things like vaccines and stuff like that, if they're more involved in research and working with academics, then hopefully they would have a greater trust in science itself and the research process and how that happens. But what we also find is that this kind of way of doing co-production, where we're involving people in a much more in-depth way in research, there isn't a huge amount of evidence about that kind of way of doing research and whether it does actually lead to these improvements that we think it will. So there's still a sort of smallish evidence base about that. Okay, so which leads us on to why should we evaluate the impact of public involvement on research, or should we evaluate the impact of involvement on research? What do we think? Anyone?
Yeah, I think that we have to, because I think it's tricky. I think it's genuinely challenging at times, and we don't know whether we get it right or not. And I think it's constantly evolving and we're constantly learning more about it. And unless we evaluate it more thoroughly, then I think that we have, then I think we need to do it even more thoroughly than how we do it now.
Yeah. So there's like different ways of doing it, and if we don't evaluate it, we don't know whether we're doing it in the best way or the way that's going to be the most effective and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And anyone else?
I think I'll probably just follow what you said there, really, just so you can get the right balance. So is there such a thing as too much public involvement where you lead too much on what the public wants and not what the science says? So maybe getting that balance. What is the perfect balance in between the both of? They may not want to do a certain aspect, but it is beneficial for them. So working away around it, not just not giving in, but not just letting the patients dictate, but also letting them have a say, but getting that in between so it fits perfectly in. There is benefits to it, and uptake will be high. So understanding how much public involvement should be, or like how much or how little, for instance.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Like Jenny said, it can be quite challenging sometimes doing public involvement, and also I suppose there's quite a lot of time. There can be quite a lot of time and effort and money involvement in it as well. So, if potentially it isn't helping the research or even potentially harmful in different ways, then we need to know about it, and we need to be able to think about how to mitigate any risks that there are. Susanna, did you think of anything?
Yeah, I agree with Ron that there should be a balance.
I mean, some people think we shouldn't evaluate it because it should just be done as a matter of course. Like you should do. It doesn't matter whether public involvement is good or bad or indifferent. That if there is this moral obligation to do it, then we should just do it and not think about whether, do we over evaluate things. I suppose as researchers we like to evaluate everything, don't we? So it's an argument. It's a philosophical argument, I guess. Yeah, so in the literature, we say it's good practice to assess interventions, of which public involvement is one. There's a lot of cost and resources involved in doing, good public involvement, especially co-production when we're thinking about trying to involve people, from very early stages, in grant applications, in writing papers. It takes time and effort you can't just expect somebody who's never worked on research to be able to do those kind of things without support and training, and understanding and building up relationships, and all of that takes time. So it may be at the moment that, there's generally funding for public involvement, but it may be in the future that the funders want to see more evidence about the way in which you're going to do public involvement, and that there is evidence that there's impact and outcomes from that public involvement. So we may in the future have to show that more. So we need to think about how we will do that and how we will evaluate it. If we evaluate public involvement, it might help to improve the quality of it, as we said. And there could also be harm potentially from doing public involvement, whether that's to individuals or to the research itself, like Sean maybe suggested. We need to take steps to avoid that happening. And the last one is quite an important one in a way, because even in the ARC we reimburse members of the public for their time, but a lot of involvement asks people to volunteer their time, and people do care about, they work with us because they want to make a difference, and sometimes it's because they have a condition that or somebody that they care about has a condition that they want to try and improve their quality of life, but they want to know that their involvement has made a difference. So if we evaluate the impact of public involvement, it gives us more evidence to be able to go back to people and say, this is the difference that you made. If you hadn't been involved in this research, then this would have been different. We wouldn't have changed these things. So it gives us more information to go back to people and be able to inform them about, what has changed because of their involvement, which I think is quite important. Okay, so normally at this point I get everyone to go in breakout rooms, but because there's only like 4 of us, I think we're not going to bother with that. Usually if there's loads of people it can be a bit hectic, but I think we're just going to do it all together as a group, if that's okay. So what we used to do in the past was to go in a breakout room in pairs and then talk about our experiences of involving the public. Can you give examples of that? Do you think that doing public involvement has improved your research, or the opposite? Not made it worse? Are there aspects of public involvement that you have personally found difficult or easy to do? Is public involvement different in ARC Northwest Coast than other places that you may have worked? And have you used GRIPP2 before? So maybe we'll just go round in a circle and start with the first one. So experiences of involving members of the public in your research. Anyone want to jump in with their own experience? What experience have you had of that?
I've had a little bit, not overly amounts. Quite an early career researcher, so I haven't done too much. But involving the public, I've done focus groups before. I've done interviews, and the idea originally that was to inform another piece of research, but this was in my MPhil, so it didn't actually quite get to that next point. So although I have began the start of this, so including public to help inform a further piece of research, it didn't actually go to that piece of research, so I don't actually know how much it would have helped or wouldn't help. But I think personally, from my point of view, because what I mostly look at is physical activity or exercise and getting people more active, less sedentary. I think from my point of view and the work I do, it is very important. The amount of people, as I said earlier, that say, oh, I don't like doing that, or I like this aspect, I don't like that aspect. I know from my own views, one person actually said there was a competition and they were doing it within the workplace of how to get how many steps. And I actually said to put them off. Said they don't like competition, they don't like being maybe towards the bottom. And it's just getting those different ideas and trying to tailor to everyone that I found is really important for what we do, to try to avoid things that are going to separate people from the rest of the group, especially maybe not all the time, probably a bit of stereotype, but sometimes they're the people that need that extra push. Sometimes what we see, obviously, the most active people always volunteer for these type of studies. So trying to get those people who are more sedentary. So I found it very interesting getting those different points. So I think for my work, it will be very beneficial. But as I said, I haven't actually made that transition yet. So I can't say fully.
How did you find doing the focus group? How many people did you have? Did you have to find the people yourself, or was it like a group that was already set up? Or
we just advertised in a local CCG, excuse me, and council. We done groups of 3 to 5. The main struggle I found was there's always, I don't know what anyone else found, but there's always someone who maybe takes over. Not in a bad way. There's not necessarily a bad way. You need those people who like obviously talk a lot, but it's trying to get other people involved, trying to get everyone's aspect, because someone can take over. And I also found at one point we were talking about physical activity, and someone started talking about Star Wars somehow. So it's trying to drag the conversation back to exactly what you're looking at, what you're looking for. I'm trying to do it in a tactful way as well. But yeah, it does surprisingly go in all different directions somehow.
yeah, that's very true. Like, we expect everybody to do public involvement now, but we don't always like learn those skills of like how to facilitate groups and stuff like that on with the work that we do. What about you, Jenny? How have you found doing public involvement? Any examples?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I've worked in the ARC and I've worked in Clark prior to that, and I've worked on a research patient benefit project for that, and before that was in public health. So I've got quite a history of public involvement and a variety of different ways. I do, the way that we've approached it in the Clark and the ARC is very different to what I'd experienced previously. And, obviously our aim is to try and embed it in everything that we do and to take more of a co-production approach, so I can see the real difference between the work that I did prior to the times that I've worked in Clark and ARC, which was a little bit more, I guess, like what Sean's saying, where you have your focus groups or you've got your steering board that might have a couple of patients on it, compared to what we're trying to do now, which is trying to have, representatives in every part of the work that we're doing all the time, from the outset to the conclusion of it. But yeah, so I've got quite a bit. I guess one of the examples I could talk about was when I worked on that research for patient benefit project, which wasn't a Clark or ARC project. It was before I came to the Clark, but that was a little bit, so because it was an intervention, I'll use that, because that was developing an intervention, was don't always have the opportunity to do those kinds of projects in ARC. And that used a different variety of perspectives, but ones that I still really liked because it was quite in-depth. So that did have parents and young people on the steering board to have their voices. It also had it was very in-depth in terms of the qualitative work, because we video recorded people in their consultations, and then we watched those consultations back with the young person and their parent, and got this different perspective, watching themselves back straight after their consultation and what they had and hadn't understood, because it was very much around communication, how to improve communication, you know, what tools to develop to, you know, give agency to young people in the consultation process. So it was really revealing, and we also had focus groups with young people and with parents. We didn't go in with any assumptions over what the intervention should be. So in that sense, it was co-produced because they really wanted something web-based. And I know that that's where the consultants that I worked with were going as well. We didn't, you know, we weren't established. That wasn't what we were going to develop, but it became very apparent that that's what young people and parents wanted. And we also developed paper-based tools and tools that could be downloaded from the website. So it was a mixture, and it could be used in different ways, and it served different, you know, perspectives. So it was quite flexible as a tool for education and for improving communication. So it had kind of consultation preparation tools that could be downloaded and completed before. All of this was about agenda setting in the consultations. So these came from the videos that we watched with people and the discussion that took place afterwards with the young person about how they prepare for their consultation, you know, with the kind of questions that they want to ask, the information that's important to them to take away from a consultation. So that was a really good lesson on, you know, taking on board what young people and what parents do and what they want to achieve from that, and how we could help them. And I felt as if it was quite driven by them, even though for many aspects of that, they were actually the participants and not just the public involvers. You know, there's always that real grey area, isn't there, where, you know, you've got your public involvement as part of your steering board, but then you've got your focus groups, but in some ways they're still very much participants, research participants as well. So I do find that there is a grey area there, but it still did shape everything that we did as well. So in that sense, they were very much involved, and it did help to co-produce the work. But yeah. So that's one example of where I could say that it influenced what the actual output was in terms of an intervention of sorts, you know, tools to use.
And when you wrote, I presume if it was research for patient benefit, they would have expected you to write that up in quite a lot of detail about the methods that you used and how you had planned to do public involvement for this deliberate outcome around, you know, the whole thing was planned around that, I presume. So in your when you wrote it up, you know, did you talk about the impact of how you'd done things and what you could have done differently and stuff like that?
No, I don't think that we did. I mean, and I think it was a missed opportunity. I mean, I know there was some issues with, I think when you move from job, that's also a problem. You know, when work gets kind of left, I do still have a draft paper about the actual methods that we use, you know, and that's half the problem, I think, because I moved from that job before everything was complete into Clark, you know, and that some of it gets left unpublished in that sense sometimes when, you know, the PI is now retired, you know, and other issues kind of come into play. But the methods that we used were quite novel at the time, you know, watching a video recording of a consultation back with young people and their parents and getting their perspectives. It's called like a video elicitation methods. You know, it was really powerful, and it's not very commonly used at all. But, you know, it was really, and it was the first time I'd ever done it because, you know, I'm quite a mixed methods researcher, but I'd never done such in-depth qualitative work before that.
Was it difficult? I mean, were there, you know, obviously you learnt a lot from it, but, you know, did the young people find it difficult to sort of watch themselves? I mean, people can be funny about watching themselves, listening to themselves and stuff. Did they find it good?
I thought it would be more difficult than it was. And actually, I think young people don't seem to mind at all. Maybe there's a generational difference there. I thought it would be much more difficult, even the consent process, I thought, you know, and some people just wanted the audio, so that was fine. We just did audio. And followed it up with like a telephone interview afterwards and other things, you know, didn't necessarily listen. Some people could listen back to it. It's not quite the same effect. But yeah.
That's a really important point, Jenny, though. I think that like sometimes we build up these barriers in our head to like thinking that something's going to be difficult, because we get that a bit with this you know, the stuff we're doing around seldom heard voices and stuff, and people are a bit like, oh, that group is going to be really hard to talk to, so don't know how we're going to do that. And you're a bit like, well, maybe you should just go and find some ways of finding them and then actually talk to them.
It's not as difficult when you actually go out and do it. I think it's just going, biting the bullet and going to do it, isn't it, really?
I think we as researchers, we can be quite nervous about maybe talking to members of the public, because it is a bit out of the comfort zone. It's not quite the same as sitting in a meeting with a load of academics and talking about methodologies, but it's still part of what we do. What about you, Susanna? Have you had any experiences of working with members of the public and research?
Not really yet, because I'm trying to recruit public advisors at the moment.
Okay.
I'm waiting for them. So.
Waiting for them to apply to be a part of your... So before this, you haven't really involved members of the public in what you've done?
I was working as a psychologist, so I was working with the people, but I did not involve people in research in that way.
Okay, so you've got some experience of working with members of the public, but not in involving them in research.
Yes.
And what, Sean, were you involved in physical activities and like working with people in general before you got into research, or not really?
No, just purely from the undergraduate. I lead more towards that, and then got opportunity for MPhil, and just sort of went from there, really.
Yeah. I mean, I would say I've done some pieces of research, but to be honest, before this job, I hadn't really. I did a piece of participatory evaluation with like a social prescribing type model, where, you know, it's interesting as a researcher, because sometimes, you know, when you're doing a PhD, your project from beginning to end, and well, and sometimes I realize with a funded PhD, someone's already given you the title or whatever, but you can shape the methods and you can think about how you're going to do it. But quite often as a researcher, sometimes you're brought into something. So my experience was quite often of doing somebody else's research. So they'd already done the research question, they'd written the protocol, they'd maybe already done the ethics even. Sometimes I've been involved in ethics, and sometimes someone said, right, just do this thing. And it can be quite frustrating, because you can already see that there's issues with it that maybe you would have done differently, and you just think, that's not actually really going to work. But so I was involved in some participatory research where they wanted to involve members of the public in a certain sort of way. But when I tried to actually do what they wanted me to do, it was just like the people that I was working with were very socially isolated. Some of them hadn't, you know, even left their house for a couple of years, and they wanted us to sort of do focus groups. And what I found, like you were saying, Sean, not just that someone else, but there's no way. And they were also living in areas where there was local ill feeling based on where you live geographically. So they'd say, all right, we want to do a focus group with this area. And when I spoke to the community connectors, they were like, well, those people are definitely not going to be able to be in a room with those people, because there's all these arguments going on and stuff, or people that were so socially isolated that they were scared to talk to anyone. So they're not going to sit in a group and be able to speak like that. So we had to sort of totally change and go back to ethics and say, this isn't going to work, we need to change all these different things about it. So I don't know whether you've had experiences like that, Jenny, of like having to try and manage other people's ideas.
Not quite like that. I've never had to go back, not with the public involvement side of it either, no. But I guess recently I have had the chance to kind of write a work package in a large grant, you know, and it is all around public involvement. So that has been really nice, you know, to be involved at that stage and to be given that responsibility, to do that using the ARC principles, to be honest, you know, with the work package co-produced with a member of the public, and really spend some time consciously designing what I think it should be like for, you know, a 5-year long project. And, you know, and it was a gamble, you know, but yeah, it's so nice. Like you say, you don't often get the chance to do that. You know, you are like the research for patient benefit one. I was lucky. I didn't write the research question. I didn't get the funding for it. I didn't even do the ethics for it. I did all the amendments that came after, but they were more minor ones. You know, we still went with their methodology. And I, like I say, was a little bit dubious, but it worked out just fine. And so no, I haven't had those challenges, but I have had the, you know, really great experience of doing something like that from scratch recently. And it's, you know, only just come to a conclusion, a very positive conclusion, and got feedback from the reviewers. And actually it was really, really positive, you know. So I think, yeah, I think you live and learn. Certainly you do.
I think people do appreciate it when they can see that it isn't, I mean, people use these terms, don't they, like tick box exercises or the usual suspects and all this sort of thing. But sometimes that clouds what it is that we're doing. You know, I think if someone can see that you really have thought about things and you can explain why it is that you did things in a certain way, and even if it doesn't go exactly the way you want it to go, you're able to articulate, okay, this happened and this is what we learned and this is how we dealt with it and this is what we changed to make it work differently, then anyone that's reviewing that is going to see that you didn't just throw somebody in, speak to them for an hour, throw them out again and not have anything to do with them. And
absolutely.
But it's interesting what you said earlier as well about that, you know, that the way that we do research doesn't necessarily give you time afterwards to even write things up, let alone think about things like impact and dissemination. And you know, we say to members of the public, especially if we've involved people in the co-production, you know, members of the community, that, you know, we'll, you know, work with them at things at the end of the project around sort of impact and dissemination, but quite often that doesn't happen. And I think that can lead to people feeling quite, you know, if someone's put in time and effort into being involved in research and then we don't go back and say, this is what happened and this is, you know, this is the final stuff and can you be involved in disseminating it, then it can lead to a breakdown in trust as well. So we need to
absolutely think it's a systemic problem in academia, you know, and it all comes down to the short-term contracts that people are on, you know, because, you know, you're always looking for the next job, and you move with that and you know, and that's what happens. And so without that continuity, you know, you don't have it. And without that security, you know, you literally got to move on. And it's a shame for the projects and for, you know, and for what could come afterwards potentially. But there's so much movement of people that is the problem. And it's not intentional. It's a fallout, you know, like many things are. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, and also another example that I've got from that, which, you know, I was disappointed. We had a really, really successful public involvement group that we set up at Liverpool Heart and Chest from one of my PhD students' projects. That's really been, you know, the actual work that they were involved in. It's really informed this future grant application that we're doing now. But sometimes I think it's about managing expectations, and that's been an issue for me. And for us on that project, because we had such a passionate group of people that were involved in every aspect of the PhD. We met really regularly, but as well, I think it's not for me to control that. It is for the PhD student, although I was very much involved in every aspect, and that the public involvement group needed to understand that at some point that person needs to go away to write their PhD up and that there would be a lull, you know, and that lull lasted longer than we expected and you had to go back into clinical practice, but they still expected that constant, you know, continuity. And it should have happened, but the practicalities sometimes are somebody's under so much pressure, they've got to write up their PhD, they've actually working again at the same time, and they've just got to finish off their work, you know, meet the demands on them.
Yeah.
That was a problem because, you know, some people then didn't want to pick that up again you know, so that was a
They
real
felt
shame.
upset that they
Yeah.
didn't understand why that had happened, and they
No,
thought,
as much as we try to communicate that, you know, I'm sorry, we can't have those regular meetings just now because, you know, the PhD's got to be written up, you know, and you know, and the member and the person is also working full time as well now again, and you know, and it's hard even when there's a team of people there. It's still very difficult, and then people don't want anything to do with it as much as they really, well, not everybody, but you know,
no.
some people, and that's really disappointing and very tricky to manage because, you know, we're all working on multiple projects, we're all working with multiple members of the public, and then obviously you've got a PhD student and who's also a working clinician and other things like that. So I think it's very difficult to manage expectations in some circumstances, and I've found that quite challenging. You know, and we know, obviously looking back, you know what you needed to do and you know what should have been done, but having the time to do it, and especially again, I think continuity and moving jobs comes into that as well, because that also came between the change between Clark and ARC. You know, so when we all had to, you know, it was still a change between Clark and ARC where, you know, your contract is coming to an end and you may or may not get a new one. So still, although I'm still in the ARC, that's not guaranteed. That's still, as a researcher, you're applying for the roles at the same time. So again, that again is felt like fallout from that lack of continuity and lack of long-term position that we all have, even though, you know, in the ARC we're luckier than some who were only on 6 or 12-month contracts.
Yeah, that's been my experience. You know, if you're lucky, a year is, yeah, that's quite long, and 2 years is like anything like that is quite a long time for a researcher. So yeah, no, absolutely. That's really interesting, Jenny, and hopefully that's been helpful to Sean and Susanna thinking about planning your public involvement with your PhD, and that thing around managing expectations. I think, you know, we were talking about evaluating the potential harms of public involvement, and I think, you know, sometimes members of the public, you know, do get emotionally attached to the work, especially if it's talking about a condition that either they have or someone close to them has, or they're a carer of. You know, a lot of the work we do around people with things like dementia and stuff like that, you know, it can be something that's very close to their heart. And then, you know, it's great for them to have that involvement in the research, but we have to be aware that people might find it upsetting, you know, if we don't manage those kind of expectations and stuff like that. Have you found, you know, you saying that you've done public involvement before, Jenny, and then the ARC does it a bit differently. How have you found that kind of difference around trying to do co-production in a different way? Do you like it, or did you prefer it?
No, I like it. I think it's just and obviously I think it's just the focus of it now has changed. Even the NIHR's focus of it's changed from what is acceptable and what's desirable. It's just, you know, it's become more, I say, necessary, but also I think it's just because the importance of it is more recognized as well. So obviously I've been a researcher quite a number of years, so that's why I can look back at the differences. When I worked in public health, we didn't do co-production. We didn't have members of the public involved in anything, you know, and I think we could have done. It just wasn't even on the agenda at all. It wasn't even discussed. And then the research patient benefit was the first time that I really came, you know, became in touch with that. But that, I guess that's because it was an NIHR funded project as well. But again, you know, that was quite involved. But like I say, more because members of the public and patients were participants, and I think that we involved them very much, so that you could say that it was co-produced to a degree, but we didn't have the numbers of, you know, of participants, you know, patients and parents involved on the steering board and in every other aspect of the project that, say, we would as a Clark, and now even more so maybe as an ARC. And I think it's great. I think, you know, the more the merrier, to be honest. But I know what Sean's saying before about, you know, sometimes you have the really passionate voices, and you do have that concern sometimes about, you know, professional, you know, patient and people who are, you know, involved, who are involved in everything. But they do have a lot of experience as well. But yeah, I agree. It's trying to find that balance and trying to get that refreshed sometimes, trying to get new voices and trying to get those ones who are, maybe quieter, but have still got something very much to say, to be heard as well. So yeah, but it's all part of the challenge of it, isn't it? But I think we do need all of those voices, because the ones that are very vocal are often vocal because they've got a lot of experience on the ground.
Yeah.
And in other committees, so they bring that with them as well.
I find a bit as well that, because I've had obviously that kind of people concerned about that in terms of, when we've got we try and make sure we've got a diverse group of people working as public advisors, but at the end of the day, how they can be representative of every type of person on the Northwest is not very possible. But I think what we're finding some of the time is that the people with those big personalities and those sort of big voices, if you can harness that and maybe help get them to support other, we've set up a new like a buddying mentoring scheme now, where we get like experienced advisors to support newer ones, and that's working really well. So trying to sort of see it as, it can be difficult, but if you put people in positions of power where they're supporting other people that maybe are struggling to have a voice as much, sometimes that can work quite well as well. But it does take time, like you say, to learn all these things. And you said that you had used GRIPP2, you think, but...
No, I realise now what I mean. I actually wrote it into that bid I was talking about. But that's why I wanted to come on the training, because I'm not that experienced with it. But I've read around it, and I've read about it, and I've looked at the tool and everything. That's why I felt like I was familiar with it, because I had to look at what we would do in terms of evaluation. But I've not used it, I don't think. No, but I've read around it. Yeah.
And Sean and Susanna, have you ever used it or heard of it before?
No, I haven't even heard of it before, to be honest. I'm not going to lie. I've not come across it before.
And Susanna?
No.
Okay. Right, well, we could probably talk about public involvement all day, but we should probably get back to the train. I'm always running over. I don't want to take all your day, so I'll move on. So I'm just going to talk a bit about some of the processes that we have in the ARC that are opportunities to think about public involvement. So the HIAT, which stands for the Health Inequalities Assessment Toolkit, which I think was created, I don't think it was the ARC, but someone in the ARC was involved in creating it. Is that right, Jenny? Do you know much about it?
We created it in the Clark, obviously. Professor Jenny Pope and Anna Esquerdo, I've got a double-barreled thing name. What's her other name?
Paroche, is it?
Paroche, that's the one. Took the lead on that, but as a Clark, this was one of the it was set at the outset of Clark. It was that they wanted to develop this tool, that we had something concrete to use moving forward, and it took a couple of years. Took a lot of workshops, so I was involved, as all Clark staff were, and other members of the public and everything, and some members and partners, etc. We were all involved in the workshops that contributed to the development of it, and the redrafting over time of it, and the piloting of it. So that was a piece of work that happened in Clark over time.
So the HIAT is a toolkit to help people before they start their research to look at how it's going to affect how inequalities are going to be affected potentially by the research, what groups, all these type of things. So there's quite a lot of sections in it when you look at it, that look at the kind of groups and communities which are going to be affected by your research. And I think that this is a good tool, an opportunity to plan in more detail about appropriate engagement and involvement activities. One of the things that I'm trying to talk about in these workshops is, we have this remit to do co-production, but also to involve communities in the Northwest Coast. So I think we're doing really well with co-production and our processes around having public advisors involved in all our projects, and that they're involved in all the activities of the ARC. But I think we could possibly still do a bit more around involving, the wider communities in the Northwest Coast. So what I would potentially like to say, some of the researchers in the ARC do more public involvement than others, and sort of see that as maybe it's the skill set, or maybe they enjoy it, or maybe they're doing research that's easier to see how it's appropriate to involve other people. But I would like people to use the HIAT to think about whether there are other groups and communities that they could involve, and maybe use the public advisors that are attached to their project to think about maybe doing something like a focus group, or working with a third sector organisation in the field, or depending on what the condition is that you're working with, so that we can do a little bit more public involvement around communities than we're. So still doing co-production, still having our public advisors like we do now, but also thinking about those wider things. So I think the HIAT, because it's done at the beginning and because every project does it, is a good opportunity to work with our public advisors to think about how we could do that a bit more in communities around our area. Oops. Next. So at the moment, what we tend to do in the ARC, or what would go back one previous, is we have this database of public advisors. We have about 75 public advisors. Not all of them are really, really active, but there are about 75, and we are recruiting people all the time. And you can either involve people, go to our database and sort of do almost like a little job description about your research and what kind of support and advice and involvement you might want to have. Or researchers can go out and find their own public advisors based on what kind of, if they're doing something with a very particular community or with a very particular condition that's more rare and that we might not have somebody, or they're already working with a group, say, they might want their own public advisors. But for them to be paid by our financial processes, they need to be signed up to the ARC. So researchers quite often bring in public advisors, and then they're signed up as an ARC advisor, and then they can also get involved in other projects, not just the one that they came in from. And we're trying to get people to recruit as early as possible. So I mean, that isn't always easy, but theoretically we want to involve people at the stages where we're thinking about things like research questions. So the ARC at the moment's got these new research development networks, so that's thinking about what kind of research we might be doing. So we're trying to involve public members in those sort of things. Sometimes we're trying to suggest that people get public advisors involved at, maybe even in the ARC it's more possible because we can involve people when we're thinking about grants and stuff like that, but in other places it can be hard to involve people before all that's already been done. So people end up being involved like when the research question's already been set, the methodology's been set, the ethics have been written, and they're almost starting the research, and then they involve members of the public. We try and do that earlier if possible. And again, like I said, some people, that's all they do. They involve these two public advisors and they become part of the research team, and like Jenny was saying with her PhD, they're involved in the process all the way along, hopefully right through to writing of papers, maybe being co-authors, and maybe even helping with dissemination or talking at conferences, those types of things. But I suppose I am asking this question, do you think that we could do more? Could we be involving other communities? What do you think, Jenny? Do you think we do enough, or do you think?
I think I come at it from a different perspective, thinking about the studies that come through our theme. And maybe we need more advice sometimes on how to do it better. But I think I struggle to think how, for some of the people, I'm just thinking of some examples that are coming through at the moment.
Yeah.
How we can involve communities. I'm not saying we can't, or how we can encourage people who want to lead their projects, which is, part of it as well, to involve communities. I don't know when, like you say, if it's clinical and they already have access to patient groups. And for some research questions that come through our theme particularly, they're very focused. So they are only interested in somebody with a very specific condition.
Yeah.
I think that limits, maybe that's my view, and maybe that needs changing, how we can then involve other communities. Different if it's like an organization that's focused on that topic, obviously with, heart-based conditions, that's different. I think you can be more flexible. With some that I'm thinking about, one that's coming through, which is like vitreoretinal kind of surgeries. I mean, that's just my lack of understanding about the topic area as well. I have no idea how we involve people more widely than the actual patients that they're getting involved in the project.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Like, if you do a high app for that project, I presume that people will have had to think about. So for example, I would be thinking, are there communities that are at higher risk of
Yes. Oh,
developing
yes,
these
we've done all
conditions?
that. Yeah.
So potentially those kind of communities are ones that you could involve maybe in, maybe doing something like a focus group around planning things to do with the
potentially. Yeah, I mean, we know that people from deprived areas are more likely to suffer with the condition. Although then that shouldn't mean that the patients that they're involving in the group to input into it are more than likely to come from deprived communities as well. So are they already represented or not? And obviously they've got experience of the condition and their journey through, or the delay that might have been caused because of, social, I just think that they've got more relevant experience to add to, what is needed from the clinician. They really want to know what the barriers are. If somebody that you could recruit generally from a community that's deprived, who may be at risk, hasn't got the experience,
never heard of it, doesn't know what it
never
is.
heard of it, doesn't even know that they're at risk actually. So that's interesting if that's relevant to the research question, to find out what they view as a risk and what their perspective of it is, as somebody who might not even know that they're at risk of that. But I think that depends on the research question, whereas this is relevant to people who might be undergoing surgeries related to the condition.
I think because I worked for a while, I was working before this on impact case studies for the rec process. So it's interesting looking at the process of what happens after research is finished and thinking about those wider things around, when we start a research project, we do have maybe an aim of thinking like, I might want to know X, Y, or Z, but at the end of it, we want to have some sort of impact. We want to influence a care pathway, or we want to influence guidance around treatment of a condition or whatever it is. So, if we think about ways in which, how we're going to get to that point, we're thinking about things like policy and government and influencing groups and stuff like that. So getting involved with things like any kind of third sector organisations or charities that are involved in conditions maybe helps us to have more influence further down the line, with knowing people that have that ability around implementation and stuff like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think one of the people who's going to be involved in that we've linked up with has that connection. I know I don't personally and don't know the organisations off the top of my head, but she does. And so yes, they have talked around policy and influencing it and the different networks that they're already connected to. But I mean, it's not something that I'm personally involved in. It's just something I've advised on. So they've got connections from what I can see. And they have worked through the Hyatt. I mean, I think it depends on your personal bias, doesn't it? When they talk through these issues, I think from somebody from a health inequalities perspective, you kind of sometimes want them to forget what their actual aims and objectives of their research question are. When you hear that there are people who are at risk who aren't even aware that they're at risk, you want them to change the entire question about how you then screen people more earlier in these deprived communities, and I think, trying to make somebody change their entire research question to try to reduce these inequalities is a bit challenging.
But I suppose this is a step, isn't it? This is getting people to even think about it. It might not change what is happening now, because it is difficult to change. It's like a giant iceberg, isn't it, or a boat or something. To try and get it to change direction, is quite difficult. But it might put things in people's minds to think about what they might do next and stuff like that.
Exactly.
If they're considering it.
And I think underpinning it with the Hyatt, having people discuss around health inequalities, having them ensure that they have those people involved, and it's about when they do their research and their work, making sure that they are looking at the health inequalities that are relevant to, say, the surgical outcomes or, you know, the decisions that are made for those patients. And when they write that up, that they refer to that, because that's when you will have somebody come forward and say, I want to do some research about earlier screening in these more deprived communities. So it can't happen overnight. But I think if we do embed health inequalities and in the, you know, throughout, and make sure that it's there in the outputs that are attached to it, then that's how you can have more of an impact long term. But yeah, it's slow, not overnight.
I'm going to move on to the next bit. Okay, so our processes at the moment, we expect people to carry out the hire at the beginning, to recruit a couple of public advisors, to plan public involvement. So as we've said, public involvement doesn't necessarily just occur on its own, and if it does, if we don't think about how we're going to do it and why we're going to do it and in what ways, then, you know, we might be doing an injustice. I've got some titles that I'm using there. So the PIAF, I don't know, have you ever used the PIAF, Jenny? Have you heard of it?
I've been looking at it. I haven't used it. I wrote it into that grant. We'll be using it flexibly. Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, flexibly. I think it's there to be used flexibly, and that's my.
I think it's more of a reflective.
Yeah.
You know, it's a bit. So the PIAF is. There is a slide on it in a minute. I wasn't involved in it, but it's another way of. It helps people to plan how they might do their public involvement and how they might assess it after they've done it. So it's quite a big piece of work, but there is a website large. And stuff like that. It is large, but
it's complex. It's complex, I've got to say. So I think we would be dipping in and out. I think there are elements that you can use. I don't think you have to use the whole thing.
It's a tool. It's another tool that could be useful, especially when, you know, when someone's doing something like a PhD, you've got that time to reflect and to plan things in a lot more detail than maybe people always have doing other kinds of research. So it's a tool that can be used, but I think for some researchers it could be challenging because it's written in quite a qualitative way. I think it's a very much a piece of work that's about thinking about how and why we do involvement. So,
and sometimes it is the general practicalities of it, because even designing a grant application and referring to the PIAF, there should have been groundwork that took place that's almost a piece of work right at the outset, and sometimes the timelines just do not match. You know, the practicalities of following everything from A to Z just can't be done in that way with the group of people, you know, because it requires an investment of time before people are even funded to do that, you know, and that is an issue again, isn't it?
And that's another systemic issue, isn't it? Thinking about, you know, all these things that we want to do, but if you need the funding in order to get the research, you haven't got that time to think to put these things in place at the beginning.
No.
Okay, so once you have got your funding and your research and your question and you've got your advisors, then you're going to be carrying out your research in the way that you've planned it, and you're going to be recording information as you go along about, you know, how you're doing things and what the outcomes of them are. And then finally, at the end of all that process, you can use the GRIPP2 tool in your academic papers to show how you did your public involvement work and what the impact of that is. And I'm going to walk that through with you now. What time is it? No, sorry.
It is 11:15.
Okay, so we're running out of time, as I usually do. At least we have got onto GRIPP2 before the end of the session. Okay, so GRIPP2 stands for Guidance for Reporting Involvement of Patients and the Public. And it was originally developed by researchers who were trying to extract data from published papers about public involvement. And basically what they found is when they went to all these papers, you know, there was a real lack of lack of consistency around how people wrote about public involvement, and a huge lack of detail about how people did things, what they did, when they did it, and what the impact of that was. So the researchers involved developed an original GRIPP checklist of things that they thought should be reported on in papers about how public involvement was done, and then that was followed up with a Delphi exercise, an international consensus exercise, which developed the GRIPP2 checklist. And the aim of the checklist is to help people report information in their papers, in their academic papers, about the public involvement that they've done, in a way that is useful to others, and makes the evidence on public involvement transparent, consistent, and then can inform evidence-based practice. So when we look at a paper, we can say, okay, they involve the members of, lots and lots of papers say they involve members of the public, but that's the end of the detail. So this is about the detail, about how they involve members of the public, why did they involve members of the public, and what the outcome and the impact of that was. And there's two forms of the GRIPP2. So there is a short form and a long form. Most people will use this short form. The long form is much more detailed, and it's for papers where the whole point of the paper is about public involvement. So maybe the sort of thing, Jenny, where you did, the research for patient benefit, where it was very much the planning of the whole paper was around co-production and involving members of the public. That was the point of the work. But most of the time people will be using this short form, and it's basically, this is what it might look like if you put it into your paper. It's a small table, and it divides up involvement into these 5 different sections or topics. So aim, methods, results, discussion, and sort of critical reflections. So it's very much almost like a mini little abstract, but an abstract just about public involvement and how that was done. So it reports the aim of PPI in the study, and in the papers where people publish it, they can either do it like this, where they put a page number about where in the paper they've reported those different types of things, or another way people use it is to actually put the detail in the form itself, and that's usually when they've put the form as an appendix of the paper. Some people are very worried about the idea of using GRIPP2 because journals can be very prescriptive about the way that papers are written and the word count, and it could be a bit of a worry to think about how we're going to add in all these extra words or this extra table. So you're going to have to go to the journals and find out, whether they accept tables, whether this is going to affect the word count, but possibly a way around it is to put it in an appendix so that people can see that. And I would still expect to have a small amount of information about public involvement in the actual paper itself, but then the detail would be in the appendix. Because, so for example, as a member of the public, I come from a lay background myself. I didn't start off as a researcher. I worked in maternity services as a lay person after I had a baby, and I was working on maternity committees and stuff like that. And as I got more involved in understanding research and working around research, one of the things that I found quite difficult is that the paywall around academic papers. So quite often, especially as a member of the public, you don't have access to full papers. You're only going to have access to abstracts unless it's an open source. So you can only find out so much about, it's a very much a summary, isn't it, an abstract? It doesn't tell you the detail about methods or stuff like that. So if we don't talk about public involvement in, maybe in the abstract, then some people might not even know that public involvement happened in that paper if they can't access the full paper. I mean, that's an aside, but it's just something that is difficult for members of the public that are interested in research, can't often access full papers. I don't know whether you've thought about that, Jenny, around these worries around word counts and stuff. What do you think about that?
Well, in my experience, it's often expected that there is a paragraph about public involvement in the journals anyway. I think it's easier now that a lot of them are electronic and there's kind of no word limit when it comes to supplementary information, that you can put extra information in there. But yeah, word count's always a tricky one, isn't it? But I think, people do want to see it. People want to see that you've reported on your public involvement, and they want to know about it, because it is a big issue now and it is an expectation. So I think
I mean, whether it's just me, I don't know, but I think if I read a paper and they say they've done public involvement but they don't put any detail in, I find it almost worse than if they didn't even mention it in the first place, because you just think, you don't have enough respect for it to actually tell us, you know, how you did it and what you did, or those, and it's disrespectful to the people that you worked with, I think, if you don't put any detail in, because, you know,
Yeah.
you're erasing them from the process and, you know, not respecting their input.
Yeah, and I think some journals they expect a full statement in the body of the actual document about how it is you did it and what difference it made and things like that. So I think be prepared to report that. And obviously you've got, you know, what if you've got, you know, members of the public as co-authors, you've got to state, you know, what their involvement is, and you know, and how they reached co-author status when you put, you know, your contributions in the back of your paper.
Yeah.
So I think it's always worth, you know, being aware of that. Plan of that.
Yeah, no, that's really important. Thanks. Okay, so one of the things that they talk about in the study results is that, you know, reporting both positive and negative outcomes, because it's not just about saying, oh, everything was wonderful and I involved everyone in this research and it was so good and I'm the best. You know, it's about being honest, and it's about explaining the things that were difficult. And, you know, I mean, that doesn't mean, you know, that, you know, you have to detail all the different, you know, obviously you've got ethics around, you know, people being identifiable, or that, you know, if there were difficulties that were actually, you know, that you wouldn't want to talk about. But it's about saying, how did we work through this, and how did we work as a team to try and improve things, and what actually happened. I think one of our art researchers, Rhiannon Corcoran, has published a paper quite recently that was a lot more detail about how they did public involvement and some of the difficulties that arose from that. So that's quite an interesting read. After we finish this session, I'll send you all the slides, and there's links and things that you can go to some of these papers and stuff, so you can take a look at that in more detail. So it's important to be honest and talk about, you know, things that happened. And then there's this sort of, at the end, this critical reflection on, you know, what went well and what didn't, so that other people can learn from your experiences and plan their own involvement differently. This is an example of the long part of the long form. The long form is quite long, and so they obviously report on a lot more detail about how public involvement was done and what was done. So things like cost benefits analysis, theoretical models, economic aspects of public involvement, all sorts of things like that. So probably you won't use this long form, but I do think it's worth looking at, just to give you some ideas maybe about what kind of things you may or may not want to include in your short form reporting. And obviously we haven't got a lot of time now, but when you go through these slides, I've put a couple of examples of forms that people have done. And again, you know, like anything, it's up to, I would advise, one of the things that I would say is when we've gone through these example forms, neither of them seem to have been written with the members of the public that were involved in these projects. They're very much researcher-led documents. So I would say it's good practice that we should involve our public advisors in writing the GRIPP2 form at the end when it's going to be going into the research, so that it's a bit of a joint effort. Yeah, so, you know, for example, this short form, their aim is that they included a patient voice, and it was a systematic review, so they wanted people to be looking at the themes and making sure that they're relevant to that population and that there's validity to them. There isn't a huge amount of detail about the methods, about how they did this, that it was a group that was already established by another organisation. They say that the members were varying in background and experience, that they met regularly and at key points, and that their outcomes were that they provided a strong patient and carer perspective. The thing for me is that I would say that this doesn't give a huge amount of detail and doesn't necessarily tell me what I would want to know about this. So I think it's important to read them and think, what would I want to know from this, and is it included? I think the most important thing that I got from reading this is that the group identified additional areas in the theme, such as boredom, should be included. So for me, you know, when I think about evaluating public involvement, one of the things that I would want to know is what has changed, what wouldn't have been in this work if they hadn't had that patient voice. So having boredom as a theme is something that was actually, you know, they've identified as something that was changed because of public involvement. So that to me is important. And then if we look down at the critical perspective, they reflected that if they had worked with members of the group more closely on analysis, they would have had a stronger service user voice, and that they could have created the conditions for co-production. So they're saying, you know, they didn't co-produce this study. You know, they did involve members of the public, but it wasn't co-production, and that they could have potentially done it in a better way, maybe. And then there's another example which I won't go through now because we're running out of time, but you can have a look yourselves about that and critique it and see whether you think it tells us what we would want to know. So some of the tips that I would have about using GRIPP2 is, you know, it's a reporting tool, it's a checklist. So it's something that you're going to do at the end of your work. So it's not, you can use it as a way to help you plan what you're actually going to do. But it's not telling you anything about how to do your public involvement. It's just a way of reporting it at the end. So you need to think beforehand about how you want to do public involvement, what methods you're going to use. And sometimes it can be helpful to think about some of the impacts that you want to have from your public involvement. So some of those could be relating to the research, like changes to your, like Sean was talking about, and Jenny about an intervention, about research instruments. So some of the outcomes might be making sure that a tool is, you know, as useful as it can be by using members of the public. It could be thinking about what outcome measures you're going to collect, how you're going to collect data, or some of the impacts could be to the members of the public. So some of your impacts could be, you know, around training, it could be around changing people's attitudes. You could do impacts around patient information documents, or it could be much more, you know, around improving recruitment, retention to studies, or actually right further down the line around impact on future health outcomes from the involvement of the members of the public. What you do not want to do is plan your study, carry out your study, start writing your paper up and go, oh, I want to use GRIPP2. This is something that you want to think about at the beginning and plan for, and make sure that you're recording information as you go along, because you're not going to remember your public involvement. You know, you don't want to be thinking back, well, 3 years ago I did agree, we had a chat and I can't remember what we said and who was there. You know, so you want to be recording this kind of information as you go along, so that, you know, you can have a really in-depth and interesting discussion with your public advisors that at the time, you know, you have those sort of insights where you're thinking, oh, that's really important, and that is really, you know, so the things that come up as those, like, you know, those moments where you're thinking changes about your research or the way that you're going to do something based on these conversations, you need to be making notes about that as you go along, that you are then going to use when you fill in your GRIPP2 3 years later and say, ah, yes, that happened, that led to this change, that led to that change. So you don't want to be having to think about it 3 years later and can't remember it. So what I'm saying is you should report, you know, after each meeting that you have, you know, make some short notes about what happened, and any changes that you might make based on that, so that you can record that as you go along for your GRIPP2. And it should be part of your usual processes. And you can also use that information, like we said at the beginning, to feed back to your advisors about the impact that they're having after meetings, and say, oh, that was really insightful what you said about that I'm going to change X, Y, and Z based on our conversations. You know, I hadn't thought about, you know, whatever it was. And that's made me think differently, and then that makes people want to stay involved, because they're seeing the impact of what their involvement is having on the work. Jenny, did you want to say something?
No, I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to leave.
I know.
We've got another meeting, but it's been really useful. It's been really helpful. Thanks
pretty much at the end, and you can always come back to me if there's anything else that you want to.
I will do, and I'll look over everything else that's on your slides as well when you send them over. That's great.
There's only a couple more.
Nice to meet you all.
Thanks, Jenny.
Right.
Are you two all right just for a couple of minutes?
Yeah, I'm fine, yeah.
Yeah.
No problem.
Not as busy as Jenny.
No, not quite.
I'm
No.
always running over. Right, I'll just finish. We're nearly at the end. Okay, so after you've done all this sort of data capture, you can then, at the end of your research, include one of these tables in your published paper, either in an appendix or in the paper itself. And we can then build in this into our reporting structures in the ARC internally, but also to the NIHR. So this is the PAF that I was talking about briefly, which is the Public Involvement Impact Assessment Framework, which, as Jenny was saying, was something that was designed during Clark. And it's a way of looking at designing an assessment of the impact of public involvement in research. It's not an assessment toolkit, it's a framework for building an impact assessment plan. There's a website, so when you get down to the when I send you the slides, you can click on this link. That's to the guidance itself, but if you just go to the PAF website, there's more information there about it that you can use. And it's more about planning public involvement, so yeah. So some of the top tips, as I said, don't leave completing GRIPP2 to the end of the study, making sure that you're recording information as you go along. And you can even use it to help start planning your public involvement at the beginning. Making sure that you report both positive and negative outcomes. It's about not saying that everything was great, but just saying what did we learn from the things that were difficult. So using GRIPP2 is going to contribute to the evidence base of what works. So if we don't report on what didn't work, then we're not learning from that. So that's why we want to do that. So what's in it for you as a researcher? Well, for ARC Northwest Coast, we're committed to co-production with the public and community. So this is a way of us showing what the impact of that is and learning more about, as Jenny said, the way that we do co-production in the ARC is quite different to maybe other institutions and other research organisations. So if we evaluate the work that we do, then we're building that evidence base around saying the way that we're working is different and the impact that it's having is X, Y, and Z. So it's important that we report on it so that we can improve that evidence base. Using the GRIPP2 tool is going to help you to plan, record, and evidence your co-production and involvement work. Implementing GRIPP2 is going to improve our ARC reports to the NIHR, and it helps you to reflect on your practice and provide feedback to public contributors. And further down the line, when you are an established researcher, all this evidence that you've recorded is going to be useful for you when you're thinking about your case studies and processes around research excellence and evidencing what kind of public involvement you've been doing over the years. So there are some limitations of GRIPP2. As public involvement manager, this isn't the only thing that we want to do to evaluate public involvement. It's quite a blunt tool. There's lots of things that it misses out on. It doesn't look at things like culture change. So we will be doing more evaluation as a team, more qualitative work in depth with researchers and members of the public, and qualitative work as well, because the GRIPP2 is in quite a sort of standardized format, so it misses out a lot of those things. So the kind of things that we might do as a team to measure progress is we're trying to show about whether our commitment in the ARC to co-production results in better outcomes. So, we're going to record going forward the number of ARC papers that are including the GRIPP2. It's not mandated, so we're not saying you have to include the GRIPP2 in your paper. And obviously, different journals have got different requirements and stuff like that. But we are saying it's good practice and we would like to see you doing it if you possibly can. We're going to be doing an evaluation survey on involvement and more qualitative work. One of our team, Shema Hassan, is going to be doing some research studies on co-production itself. And we're hoping that we're going to see more public advisors listed as co-investigators on grants and co-authors on papers going forward. And we're also hoping to do some public advisor-led research where they're acting as PIs themselves on projects over the work of the ARC as well. And that's the summary. Has anyone, have you got any questions or anything you want to ask going forward from here?
Yeah, no, not really. I think you just went through them. My earpods went off, so I couldn't really come there for a couple of seconds. But you said that the GRIPP2 is now becoming more acceptable in journal papers, is it? So it's maybe not expected, but it's more regular that the sort of accept it a bit easier.
Yeah.
Do you think that's just going to carry on? Is that the idea generally, to make it a bit of a standard? And
I mean, it was only published, I think the GRIPP2 paper originally was published in 2017, so it's, you know, it's quite new, but we are seeing more and more papers putting the GRIPP2 table in them. And, you know, I mean, there are other ways of, you know, it's just a checklist. There are other ways that people report on public involvement, but it's good for standardization, and I think it is good practice to put it in, and it is definitely something that the NIHR like to see happening. So I think, like I said, even though we're not mandating it, you know, if at all possible, you know, if you can just put it in as an appendix, I think it's good practice. And again, like I say, working on the GRIPP2 together with your public advisors, you know, I think it should, if we're looking at co-production, why wouldn't we involve our public advisors in what's going to go in reporting about the public involvement in the study as well? So yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, well, do get back to me with any questions. I know you're early on in your work with public involvement, so if you need help or support from us, just let us know, and then we'll send you out all the slides and a little evaluation thing. So yeah, just get back to me if there's anything that wasn't clear. No,
it's great. Yeah, thank you very much.
Right. And nice to see you again, both of you, and enjoy the rest of your Monday.
You too. Thank you very much.
Take care.
See you later. Bye.
Bye.